Warning. Anomalies detected.
Thomas here with Much Props, going to give you another how-to video. Today I'm building something a bit different. No, not in terms for you the viewer, but yes, in terms for me the builder. My younger brother Tyler asked about a month ago if I would be interested in doing a commission for his friend Gavin. And if you've watched the channel, you've probably never seen me do a commission before, and there's reason for that. There's a lot that goes into commission work versus me just building stuff that I want. I have to appease a customer, and I have to make sure that those needs are being met and the expectations and all of that stuff. So it definitely adds an extra layer of stress that I don't typically like to deal with when I'm trying to relax building a prop. So I asked him, well, what does Gavin want me to build? And he said, Isaac's helmet from Dead Space. Yeah, that thing. And of course, I was like, oh, well, I've wanted to build this helmet for a while, so it kind of eases me into the commission idea. And then we start talking prices and all that stuff, and that kind of motivates me a little more. And eventually I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. So I did some research, found a bunch of images. There's lots of 3D models and people who have built it. SKS, if you look up Isaac helmet, he's like one of the first things that pops up. So I know I have some good reference images to go off of. But then I look at the remastered version of the helmet and I'm like, yeah, let's do that. Big ambition before the prop build starts. It's a lot of details, and I'm trying to nail this for a customer who is a big Dead Space fan. So today we're going to build Isaac's helmet from Dead Space. Hopefully I get this right. And I'll be using an NLITEN kit. I'll talk more about that in the video. Let's get to building. What you see here in front of you is about 4 or 5 hours of prep work. I built up the structure on a mannequin head with foil and duct tape to get my pattern. Then once the base layer was done, I had the painstaking task of trying to figure out each detail, layer, greebly, and other random bits that need to be added. This is only a portion of the build, as I have to figure out some of it as I go. In the final version of my template, which is free in the description of the video down below, some parts will have extra markings, some pieces will be modified, and there will be loads of instructions explaining on parts and the cover letter. In total, the template alone took over 15 hours to figure out. I separate out the parts into different thicknesses of foam that they'll be cut out from, and then trace the patterns onto the materials. Here I am cutting out some of the parts. Make sure when you are cutting foam that you keep your blade sharp and try to make as clean a pull as possible through the foam. Something I wanted to point out here was, notice how I am making my cuts. If it's an outside line, I start the cut well outside of my line and drag in. I lock my wrist and try to make as solid a pass as possible to the stopping point. As I get to the inside corners, you'll notice that I rock my blade up straight as it comes to the line. You want to remember your cutting edge is slanted. If you're looking at the back end perpendicular to your materials, you're going to cut a little past what you intended to. Keep your eye on the front edge and you'll get a much more precise cut. This is a pretty nice helmet base that I can definitely see getting repurposed for another build later. I have laid down a layer of contact cement on all the edges, let it set up for a few minutes, and now I'm ready to assemble my parts. I like to lay them out in the orientation that they will match up with each other just to keep it straight in my head. I start with closing up the darts. Those are the big V cuts in the foam, which will allow the flat foam to take a rounded shape. Then it's just a matter of trusting the registration marks. Those are the little U-shaped bits all along the edges. Most of the base will be covered by overlays, so you don't have to stress too much about getting it perfect. Any bad seams or mistakes can easily be turned into battle damage later. This is by no means an easy build, but if you take your time, you might surprise yourself what you can accomplish. Like I said in the last clip, there are a lot of overlays on this helmet. It has layers on layers on layers. When I'm trying to figure out the template, this can often be the hardest part, trying to understand how to make the base shape of the prop get layered to the final shape. When putting on overlays, the easiest thing to do is start by placing it on the base, trace the position that you want it to be, and then apply your glue. This will limit the amount of cleanup you have to do later, reduce the amount of glue you'll need, and it allows for less mistakes on placement. This head trim is one of those bits that will look different in the finished template, as I am straight up guessing at the shape right now. I didn't know how the front and the back end would line up with the back panel overlay or the visor on the front. Not something that you have to worry about if you decide to make it, just something I wanted to point out. I am literally making this up as I go. With almost 500 builds here on YouTube and over 200 custom templates made by hand, I've gotten pretty good at the guesswork. It is a skill that I have learned over thousands of hours of practice. This mid-ridge will cover up my seam lines on the center line. If you look at the reference images, you can drive yourself crazy adding little details on top of these details. I did my best to map out as much as I could. Once this was done, I laid a thin strip of 2mm foam on the inside of this ridge to give it a step down from the base. Here are a couple of overlays that go around the visor opening. A good portion of this will be covered by other layers, but they once again add to the overall complexity of this helmet that some may not notice. I'll do my best in the final template to put red markings where these overlays will go to kind of help others with better positioning. Yet another tiny detail that will be covered by other stuff. From what I can see in the reference images I found, there is a line texture underneath the thin slats that go vertical around the bottom edge. To make mine, I'm just going to score some lines with a hobby knife and then hit it with a heat gun to open the lines up. They don't really have to be super straight, as you're only going to see them in between each of the slats that I'm going to put on here in a second. I also didn't worry about perfectly lining them across the full length of the back. I worked section by section, knowing that I would put a slat at each of the seams to cover it up and hide any unevenness. For the slats, I cut a long strip of 2mm foam and trimmed it as I went, using a piece of one slat as a spacer. I'm about midway through my construction of the helmet and I got extremely frustrated. If you look back at the first clip, you'll notice that the back panel looks different. I built one from my initial concept only to realize that it didn't conform to the shape of the helmet, so I had to completely redesign it. With the helmet base built now, I can make a better design to fit the actual shape of the corresponding parts. Making it as a little box that stands off of the side and the back, I can now cut out the inside later to hide some electronics. So this setback ended up making my build better. Such is life. We may not be able to see the positivity in a setback, but oftentimes our mistakes can make us better. Bet you didn't think you'd get words of encouragement here, did you? You guessed it, more overlays. The back of the helmet has tons of little raised areas, holes, and other randomness that doesn't really make much sense other than to make flat surfaces seem more interesting. Before I laid these down, I did add a slight bevel to all the back panel edges. After gluing all these parts down, I went back and burned in lines I saw on my reference images with a wood burner. Make sure that if you're sanding or burning foam, you wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area because you don't want to breathe in that stuff. It's gross. It stinks. As simple as the visor pieces look in the original game, the remastered version decided to make them extremely complex. The first one I assembled is for the backside of the helmet at the bottom, but the other four are the front. My bottom layer is a darker gray foam that is much denser than the rest. You could glue these directly to the plastic visor if you wanted to, but mine will be just as sturdy without it. You'll notice in the pattern that each of these strips has multiple names names on them with different size foams listed. That means that once I trace the base layer, I cut off the extra bits and traced it again onto the next layer. As I glue each layer, I am more concerned with how the parts line in the middle. The edges can easily get sanded flush later once the assembly is done. Now begins my guesswork of how to line up each of these parts. I'll have their alignments marked on the rail pieces for the final template to make it easier for anyone ambitious enough to try this on their own. I use super glue to make quick connections to the center ridge and then to the rails. The key thing to get when aligning these parts up with each other is allowing for a proper gap between each strip and make sure that the inside surfaces are relatively close to flush with each other, as this is where the plastic visor will rest on later. Like I said previously, you could attach these directly to the visor and attach it all at once, but this would make it an absolute pain to paint later, so I'm putting the visor in after I paint. Now with all the visor panels on, I can lay down the middle ridge that goes down the front. I laid down some reference images, burned in a couple of detail lines with my wood burner, and glued on some little half cylinders I sanded out of 4mm strips. Then I glued on the middle ridges. These were an absolute nightmare to figure out how they were shaped. I think I got them relatively close to the in-game model, but who knows. You may notice I have overlays on the front of each ridge. I did this by laying down little strips of 2mm foam and then sanding them back to get that extra little detail. It's not in the template, but it's fairly simple to add if you just look at the reference images I've included on the last page of my template. Here is something that I had to make an adjustment for because of the material choices that I've made. This reference image is plastic injection molding from what I can guess, and the rail that goes around the top of the back panel only makes connection on the sides. I wanted to keep the entire build made out of foam, and I knew that this part would definitely sag over time if only supported in those areas. The foam I used is rigid, but gravity will limit this application. My solution was just to make 2 extra connection points on the middle ridge. It's not a very noticeable change in the design, but it'll add the rigidity of the part that I need. I cut 4 slits in the areas I needed the rail supports to go, glued them into place, glued the rail on top of it, then secured it down with a narrow strip of 2mm red foam over the top of it all. After some battle damages and finishing details, it all gets 2 layers of Plasti Dip. Luckily, I had some of this hammered spray paint that was close to the right color and added a nice texture to the surface. You will notice there are some parts I didn't show being added to the helmet. They are in the template with extra instructions to help you with the build. I can tell that this video is going to be pretty long already, and these little details are added just like all the other overlays, so hopefully it's not too confusing to not show every little add-on. The paint scheme is relatively simple. I think in the original it was all one color with a little bit of weathering over the top, and the remastered model, it looks like there are a few parts with a lighter shade of copper or maybe even gold. I painted these bits on with some acrylic paint, which took about 3 coats to get good coverage. I also added some random dry brushes of copper and brown to break up the solid color. It's very subtle, but if you look closely at the finished helmet, you can see the variations. Now time to dirty this thing up. I sloppily mix on some black and brown acrylic paint and push it into the cracks and crevices of the build. This step is always one of my favorites as it turns the pretty pristine surfaces into something that looks used. It helps to tell the story of the prop and can also add a lot of character to the build. It does a great job of showcasing all those painstaking details that have been labored over for hours. Once the watered down acrylic is slopped on, I dab most of it off with a paper towel. I left most in the crevices and some across the flat surfaces to give interest. After about 2 or 3 passes, I was satisfied with the dirtiness. I got these thin polystyrene sheets off of Amazon, and I'm going to use one for my visor. I pushed it into the inside ridge made from the visor rail and wedged it into place. Once I had it friction fit in, I secured it with just a thin strip of 2mm foam hot glued at the bottom. Then I ran a bead of hot glue on the sides to lock it into place a little bit better. I didn't use super glue because anytime you use super glue on plastics like this, it clouds them up. With the helmet done, now I need to take it up a notch with some cool lighting. The model in-game has a nice bluish glow. I'm going to use a LED lighting kit from NLITEN. No, they are not a sponsor for this video. They're just an awesome product that I was fortunate enough to help test out before they released to the general public, which I used on that Viking Link cosplay I made a while back to light up my shield with. They did a Kickstarter a while back that I supported, which is where I got this kit from. I was lucky enough to meet Shannon Hoover, the creator of this kit, on my vacation in Canada and got to see his makerspace Fuse 33 in Calgary. These LED lights are side emitting, so it'll shine down on the visor instead of right at my eyes, which is nice. I scuffed up the liner on the inside to hopefully catch a little bit more of the light. Then I peeled off the paper backing to reveal the adhesive and stuck them into place. The little chipset has a program that you can easily do a drag and drop coating into and make super cool and easy lighting effects. I made about 10 different lighting effects in less than 30 minutes and loaded them onto the chipset. You can control the lighting effects via a phone app by Bekonix, Bekonix. If you scan the QR code I showed at the beginning of this clip, it'll walk you through how to do all of it. The parts are all pre-soldered with easy connections, extension cables, and a USB connector that'll easily power onto a battery bank your electronics. Once I had it all laid in, I glued a layer of translucent foam over the top to kind of diffuse the light a little bit, and then cleaned up the cables by cutting in channels to hide it with some 2mm foam permanently. This is really hard to film what I'm doing, but now that I have the inside all cleaned up with cable coverage, I need to make a spot for the battery pack to live. Luckily, that mistake of the back panel I made forced me to redesign it, which in turn made a unused cavity that I can cut out from the inside to put my battery in. So I cut it out from the inside and can now store one in. The one I have on hand is a little larger than what I'll use for the final, but I need to test the stuff out, and it's not coming in the mail till this weekend, so I'm using what I got. You could also cut out the other side and put in a fan to make it more comfortable for cosplaying in longer. And we are finished. Here is the end result. Overall, I think it turned out pretty cool. It is definitely one of the most detailed helmets that I've ever built. It was pretty complicated trying to figure out some of these layers and greeblies, and hopefully, Gavin, you see the time that went into building this thing. It is by far one of the most complicated templates I've ever put together, but yeah. Maybe you'll try and make one of these yourselves and impress your friends with your ability to pull something from a video game, obsess over the details, and make something that is hopefully pretty epic. Maybe. Maybe you'll get some...
Yay!
And inevitably, they're going to ask you, how'd you make that? You give them one of these, tell them, much props. I guess it's time to... get this to Gavin, so peace out. If you enjoy what I do here on YouTube and want to see more builds like this one, please consider joining these awesome people listed here with me over on my Patreon to build a bigger, better, more creative community together.